Vampires are a subject that I historically have not been too keen on. I don't know why, I guess, because when I was growing up, we had horror movie villains that looked like this and did shit like this, but the vampire was associated with shit like this, which, yeah, okay, bad example, the original Nosferatu is creepy as fuck, but then there's stuff like this, which, yeah, I get it. I respect its place in filmmaking history and the hard work that was put into it, but it's a bit past the expiration date where I can suspend disbelief or enjoy it or anything. Outside of the Castlevania series, vampires are probably my least favorite horror movie monster because they seem to have just stuck to this one stereotype surrounding them. It's always the tragic Dracula story, and then when it does deviate away from that, it's some one-dimensional world domination plot. Get creative with it, guys. I'd like to see a movie about a vampire who is literally just trying to vibe. And oh yeah, they've done that already. I guess it's a very limited subgenre of horror. At the end of the day, my favorite horror movies are usually slasher movies or something revolving around the horrors of science or aliens or cosmic horror. I don't know why, I just feel more drawn to that type of horror. If the story can't be unique, at least the methods of murder could be, and in the case of sci-fi horror, that shit's always unique in some way or another. But the vampire subgenre has very few standouts where you look at it and think, yeah, that was vastly different from most vampire movies. The filmmakers of the 1980s really did attempt to do something different with the genre. There's Lost Boys, which I like to a certain extent, but it isn't a favorite of mine. And then there's Near Dark, which I've heard very good things about, but I have not seen that one yet. But then there's Fright Night, a movie that does not get the praise it deserves. I fucking love Fright Night, the original Fright Night. I hate having to say that, but no, I haven't seen the remake. I have no plans to see the remake. Although it's funny because it isn't the only remake of a classic 80s movie starring Colin Farrell that I refuse to watch. And yes, I know Total Recall technically came out in 1990, but that's an 80s movie. I'm sure the remake of Fright Night is fine, R.I.P. Anton Yelchin, but nah, I'm good. To me, Fright Night is the closest thing to a perfect vampire movie because it takes the regular conventions of a vampire movie and adds a dash of, at the time, modern trends to it. It was directed by Tom Holland, who would later go on to do Child's Play, and it stars Chris Sarandon, William Ragsdale, and Roddy McDowall. Basic premise is that Charlie Brewster is your average 24-year-old teenager from the 1980s. He loves old horror movies and has a moderately attractive girlfriend too, played by Amanda Bierce, aka Marcy from Married with Children.
I am not a chicken. Why does he keep calling me a chicken?
One night, Charlie is watching his favorite horror host, Peter Vincent, while trying to have a good old-fashioned clam jam with his girlfriend, and she's actually gonna put out. But he notices something strange going on next door and is immediately distracted, causing Marcy to walk out. Fright Night's strongest positive trait is the build-up. Charlie sees a coffin being moved into the house next door and starts to become suspicious, and as the first act goes on, Charlie becomes more and more suspicious until one night, while watching his neighbor get down, he full-on sees him about to feed on a chick. At this point, he is no longer suspicious and is now dead set on his neighbor being a vampire, but nobody believes him. I've mentioned before how effective a horror story is when the main character's friends don't believe him, and Fright Night utilizes this perfectly. It adds to the humor that everyone thinks Charlie is insane, but since the audience knows that Jerry Dandridge is definitely a fucking vampire, we get frustrated with Charlie when his friends don't believe him. That is how one perfectly executes this trope in any genre. Chris Sarandon is perfect in the part of Jerry Dandridge. He's charismatic, he's suave, but he also has a creep factor to him. It's like I'd probably fuck him, but then once it's all over, I'd realize that I've made a horrible mistake and am about to get killed by a vampire once the post-nut clarity kicks in. Seriously though, Dandridge is the show-stealing character, and why wouldn't he be? He's an antagonist in an 80s horror movie. Roddy McDowall plays Peter Vincent, Charlie's favorite horror host. Peter Vincent shows all sorts of horror movies on his show, and even played a popular vampire killer character, but when he's introduced as a character, we learn he isn't doing so well. His show's about to be cancelled because
apparently all they want are demented madmen running around in ski masks, hacking up young virgins.
And he's about to lose his apartment. It's true, I think slasher movies did damage that old horror host thing pretty badly. Nobody wanted to watch old cheesy vampire movies. They wanted to see people get hacked to pieces by a maniac. It's called progression, look it up. Charlie goes to Peter Vincent hoping that he can help him with the vampire problem, which seems to be getting pretty bad. Like when you have vampires breaking into your house and attacking you and spinning around and shit, you really should call someone. Also, the spin is either intentionally unintentionally hilarious or unintentionally bad. It takes me out of the movie, I'm not gonna lie. Peter Vincent basically does not believe Charlie either and thinks he's crazy, but his obsession is becoming an issue with his girlfriend and his close friend Evil Ed. Evil Ed is the hammiest character in the movie, and that's before he gets turned into a werewolf. Fright Night is a good percentage build-up, a good percentage payoff, so at a certain point the build-up hits a peak. This being when, in an attempt to prove Charlie's suspicions wrong, his friends pay Peter Vincent to play along with the vampire ordeal in order to do his vampire hunter thing and prove to Charlie that Jerry is in fact not a vampire. When all is said and done and we think that Peter is gonna just walk out of there thinking Charlie is crazy, he sees Jerry's reflection, or lack thereof, and realizes, oh shit, the fucking crazy kid was right. The build-up pretty much commences here with Jerry, who's realized that more people are onto him, deciding to take executive action. Evil Ed decides to leave Charlie and Marcy to go home by himself via some alleyways where he gets chased down by Jerry Dandridge. Now, this movie isn't a scary horror movie, but honestly, the way Jerry just calmly is walking towards Ed is rather intimidating. This is probably one of my favorite scenes in the movie because it's just a simple horror movie chase scene, but it's shot and lit so well. It's got the mist in the nicest, most perfect places, and the way Jerry is just calmly but briskly striding towards Ed, knowing full well that Ed can't outrun him. It reminds me of a predator chasing prey, which, let's be honest, if vampires were real, it would be this exact dynamic. Of course, Jerry being a vampire can turn into a bat and fly, so honestly the chase was just him playing with his food, and it all ends with Jerry biting Evil Ed after using some weird, rousing cult speech to hypnotize him. Jerry then cuts the streetlights and starts chasing Charlie and Marcy, and that's not her character's name, by the way, I'm just referencing Married with Children, into the tech noir, and honestly the club scene has 3 great fucking songs. Jerry full-on pulls the Chad Jerry on Charlie and swipes his girl, and uses his vampire seduction powers to cuck Brewster. The dance number, again, is very well choreographed. Oh, and Brewster gets put in his place before Dandridge runs off with his girlfriend. Meanwhile, Peter Vincent, having had his whole worldview shattered by learning that vampires are real, is met by Evil Ed. A scuffle ensues, and he manages to burn him with a cross. This is foreshadowed earlier in the movie, but we learn that Jerry Dandridge is drawn to Marcy because Marcy looks like a woman whom he loved hundreds of years ago. I guess only every couple hundred years does someone that moderately cute show up in the timeline. And actually, this whole movie just has many homages to Dracula, and it's kind of formatted the same as Dracula. Charlie Brewster is Jonathan Harker. Van Helsing is played here by Peter Vincent, who played a Van Helsing-like character in the movies. Marcy is Mina Harker. Jerry is Dracula, and Evil Ed is kind of like Renfield, but then the other guy who's hanging around Jerry is also kind of like a Renfield henchman type character. So, I don't know, it's a mixed bag. It's a nice little homage to Dracula, but it stands out and is its own awesome 80s thing. I mentioned this movie's best part is the build-up, and while the payoff isn't bad by any means, it's another case in film where the journey is better than the destination, because Charlie and Peter meet up and decide to confront Jerry Dandridge. Peter Vincent chickens out when the cross doesn't work because you have to believe that a cross is gonna hurt a vampire for it to do so, and he runs away. But then he goes to check on Charlie's mother, and he meets Evil Ed instead. And this scuffle is far better because Evil Ed turns into a full-on fucking werewolf, and don't ask me how a vampire biting someone turns him into a werewolf because we could be here all night. Steve Johnson, who did Ghostbusters and Nightmare on Elm Street Part 4 and Night of the Demons, worked the special effects, and being a protege of Rick Baker, fucking nailed it on the werewolf. It's a long drawn-out transformation scene, but the effects are so good I'll let it slide. To conclude the story, Dandridge turns Marcy into a vampire, it turns out his buddy was some slime zombie, and we get our final phase of the climax where they Castlevania Jerry's ass and he turns into a fucking rather creepy bat vampire thing, which, fun fact, was originally made to be the librarian ghost in Ghostbusters, but was deemed too intense for that movie. Charlie finally gets to chickenhole Marcy, and Peter Vincent gets his show back, but this time he decides to pivot his direction to be a sci-fi horror show, and everyone lives happily ever after. Except for Evil Ed, who would go on to do gay porn.
Oh, you're so cool, Brewster!
Fright Night is not only one of the goats of the vampire subgenre, it is one of the greatest 80s horror movies ever made. I love this shit so much. Even if the payoff sort of isn't as good as the build-up, it's a prime example of why 80s horror has never been outdone. The special effects are stellar, and I didn't even talk about the soundtrack composed by Brad Fiedel, you know, the guy who did the equally stellar Terminator soundtrack and several other Carlico film soundtracks. It has this sort of sleazy but eerie quality to it. The fucking use of synth and guitars for a movie score is something that needs to make make a comeback. The best example of this is the track titled Dream Window that plays when Charlie is watching Dandridge with a hooker in the window. I'm gonna play it over the credits so you can hear it there. I first saw Fright Night in middle school during the Freddy vs. Jason build-up. I mentioned this in my very first ever video. Basically, during the build-up to Freddy vs. Jason, every weekend myself and some of my friends would go down to Jumbo Video and rent a Freddy or Jason movie. But sometimes we'd try some other shit from the era and from the 90s, and we grabbed this gem one weekend. A movie is best when you know next to nothing going into it, and this was no exception. It was cheesy, but it kept our attention because it told a good story and was very well made. I'd forget about Fright Night for a few years until I was with my buddy Andrew at Blockbuster. We had just jacked our friend Adam's Blockbuster card, and this is when Blockbuster was doing their free rentals thing. You know, when the brand was going out and they were desperately trying everything they could to stay afloat? Anyway, we rented this and Friday the 13th Part 3, and Andrew never returned them, and Adam's family had to pay like 60 bucks. Adam, if you're watching this, it's all Andrew's fault. Like, I left the movies with him because he said he was gonna go return them, and he never did it, so he owes you 60 bucks. As for the $60 that I owe you for like cigarettes and booze and shit, all I have to say is there's been several birthdays that have passed by. Call off the debt. It was when I watched it a second time that this movie cemented itself as an instant classic. To this day, we still throw the
Oh, you're so cool, Brewster.
line at each other. I fucking love this movie, and I really think it should be preserved and studied for years to come. It is truly the best example of modernizing a classic concept for a new generation. It got a sequel a few years later that I never saw, I haven't gotten around to it yet, but I've heard good things about it. Apparently it has sort of a sketchy copyright issue, which is why it rarely gets re-released on new formats, but this is the age of the internet, it's around, you can watch it if you want to. Evil Ed does not return for it despite being in the stinger at the end of the first one. He decided to do gay porn instead. As for the remake, honestly, I've heard it's not the worst, but like I said, I have personal issues with it. No disrespect to anybody involved, but I'm just simply not fucking down. Oddly enough, and I only learned this recently, in the late 80s after Fright Night 2 finished shooting, Roddy McDowall set up a meeting to do a third movie because he really enjoyed playing the Peter Vincent character. He wanted Tom Holland back, and he managed to get the meeting with Carlco Pictures president Jose Menendez, but then Menendez was murdered by his two sons, causing Fright Night 2 to have a limited theatrical release before being dumped on home video, and all hopes of a sequel were lost. Or were they? Because apparently Tom Holland wants to do what every fucking horror movie is doing now, a sequel far too late that brings back all the original characters. I'm good. Pass. For what it is, Fright Night excels at greatness, and if you like vampires, horror, the 80s, or any and all of the above, it is a must-see. I have no idea how to end a video without shameless self-promotion, so if you enjoyed me barfing words out my face hole, I appreciate you, and subscribe or whatever. Later.
His dinner's in the oven.
New message, 5:14 p.m.
Otto, man. Otto, I need that 60 bucks you owe me. I need that fucking 60 bucks, okay? Like, I need it, alright? Like, you can't just do what you normally do and just say the debt no longer exists because it was a birthday present from me to you, okay? I need that shit back. And speaking of which, why did you never return that video to Blockbuster, man? Like, I know Blockbuster closed, like, over 11 years ago, but those debts don't go away. I still have these fucking collection agencies, like, hounding me for the fucking $5 movie. This stuff doesn't go away, man. You need to pay me back. You need to fucking tell these fucking the collection agencies to just leave me alone, okay? Okay? Just think I'm a good man, okay?